Good evening, and thank you very much for joining tonight for the Telegraph subscriber update in association with Gilead Sciences on Covid-19. Gilead is a US-based pharmaceutical company specializing in medicines that meet unmet medical need. We're pleased to have Dr. Mike Elliott, Vice President of Medical Affairs from Gilead tonight with us. The session tonight will last for an hour and we'll split it into two halves. For the first half, I'll be joined by my colleague Sarah Newey and Dr. Richard Hatchett from CEPI, and we'll be looking at the issue of vaccines. For the second half, I'll be joined by another colleague, Anne Gulland, and Dr. Mike Elliott from Gilead. And we'll be looking there at treatments for Covid-19 in the second wave of the pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first panelists. Firstly, we have Sarah Newey, Global Health Reporter at The Telegraph. And also joining me is Dr. Richard Hatchett from CEPI, which is a coalition for epidemic preparedness innovations. So Richard is a veteran in dealing with disaster response. He was involved with the 9/11 response in the States. He worked for both the Bush and Obama administrations on pandemic preparedness. He is an expert, one of the earliest experts in social distancing. But also over the last few years, probably the world's broadest expert on vaccine distribution and technologies. So we're very pleased to have you here tonight, Richard. Thank you very much. So we'll kick off. There's been amazing news on vaccines over the last few days, really amazing. Today, Pfizer updated its data and found the vaccine to be 95% effective, and it will be handing the data to regulators in just the next few days. Are you as excited as the rest of us, as the stock market, or are you a bit skeptical?
Well, I'll say that I'm very excited. The excitement is tempered with an understanding of the challenges that we have ahead of us. But let me talk about what's so exciting. I mean, obviously, having a COVID-19 vaccine that we know to be highly effective after a phase 3 clinical trial and that shows a good safety profile would by itself be tremendously exciting. Having two in the Pfizer vaccine and now the Moderna vaccine with the results announced earlier this week is even better. But I think what is actually historic about the news of the last couple of weeks is that both of these vaccines are vaccines that are based on mRNA technology, messenger RNA technology, and it represents, in addition to being the first COVID-19 vaccines to show positive phase 3 results and markedly positive phase 3 results, 94-95% effectiveness. They are also they speak well for the prospects for vaccines more generally, because the part of the COVID-19 virus that they're targeting is also the same part that many other vaccines are targeting. But even on top of that, even more exciting is this is a whole new class of vaccines, a brand new approach to developing vaccines. And these vaccines have been developed within 10 months of the release of sequences. It's astounding. The challenges, I'll just say a quick word about the challenges. Many observers have said that vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations do. And the challenges ahead of us in scaling up the production of these vaccines and getting them out to people are going to be immense, and we cannot underestimate those.
Bringing you up on the point of distribution and manufacture to a point there, Richard, you mentioned mRNA vaccines there. I mean, how much of the fact that this is completely new, how much more difficult does that make that process? And do you think other candidates, for instance, the Oxford AstraZeneca one in the UK, might be easier to ramp up distribution and manufacturing more quickly?
Well, the vaccines have a number of challenges in their production, and each vaccine potentially will run into challenges with the scaling up of manufacturing. And I wouldn't say that one is necessarily easier than another. There are some vaccines that we have more experience with the underlying technology. I think in terms of getting the vaccines out to people, the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, may be easier to distribute because of its cold chain requirements are less stringent, certainly, than the Pfizer vaccine, which has to be maintained at minus 70 degrees Celsius and can only be refrigerated, as far as we know right now, for about 5 days. The Moderna vaccine just announced some additional data that showed that its vaccine would be stable in the refrigerator for up to 30 days, and that'll make it somewhat easier to use. And the AstraZeneca vaccine is thought to have good stability when refrigerated. All of these factors come together when you are trying to think about how to, mobilize the vaccine, get it out to people in many different environments.
Can I ask, a typical vaccine would take, I think, 10 years to come to fruition, from concept right through to the final trials and licensing. These vaccines are coming through, I think you said, in about 300 days, so just short of a year. It's an amazing achievement, and I think, well, certainly it is partly to do with the planning and the platforms you guys put in place ahead of time. But how confident can we be about the safety, given that the timescales have been so squeezed?
Well, what's been squeezed are largely the manufacturing timelines and the sequencing of the clinical trials. These are vaccines that moved from their first production in the days and weeks after the sequences were released to phase 1 clinical trials. In the case of Moderna in March, in the case of the Pfizer vaccine in May, and then moved very rapidly into phase 3 clinical trials. Both of the vaccines entered phase 3 clinical trials on July 27th. And those phase 3 clinical trials have been completed quite rapidly, but they've been completed rapidly not because we've cut corners, but because the enrollment in the clinical trials was extremely fast. The Pfizer vaccine phase 3 trial, 43,000 people. The Moderna trial, 30,000 people. And these trials were completely enrolled. And then once the vaccines were given, you have to wait until you accumulate cases of disease, and you have to accumulate a certain number of cases of disease before you can look at the results. And of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic where disease rates are very high, and these cases have accumulated very rapidly. So everything that would be done to ensure safety has been done with these vaccines. It's just happened in a very compressed time frame.
So that's interesting. We can almost be grateful that there was a second wave then in terms of vaccines and getting more exposure.
I'll say that's a thin silver lining if you look at it that way.
I want to go to a few of the readers' questions because they're starting to roll in. And this one from Anthony I think is particularly important, and that's kind of going back to what you mentioned about the fact we're vaccinating people and it's vaccination, not vaccines, that matters. And he asked, will there be some sort of immunity passport that could be issued to vaccinated people, which would enable them to mix socially and travel? I mean, what do you think of the ramifications of vaccines? How will they help move life back to normal? And what policies might be put around them to strengthen that?
Well, so on immunity passports, certainly that is not within my sphere of responsibility. I know that those types of things have been discussed, but I'll leave that to the policy experts. I would say the importance of the vaccines is in reducing the severity of the pandemic by protecting those who are at greatest risk, and all of the observers and advisory bodies that are looking at this are recommending, particularly while vaccines are in very short supply, that they be prioritized for our frontline workers, our healthcare workers, and for those who are at greatest risk, who we know to be the elderly and those with certain medical conditions. If you target your vaccines to those populations, what will happen is you will see less people becoming severely ill, less people requiring care in hospitals, less pressure on healthcare systems, and because the healthcare systems won't be overwhelmed, you can begin to loosen up the restrictions to prevent disease transmission, and life can begin to come back to normal flows, normal economic activity over time. So whether we have immunity passports or not, if we can get vaccine to the people who need it, get it to them first, protect them, protect our healthcare systems, then we can begin to take this from being a very dangerous, moderate to severe pandemic down to something that is closer in impact to the last pandemic in 2009, which very few people even remember.
The swine flu pandemic, yeah. So, I mean, that is an important point, isn't it? Because it's the overwhelming of, or the risk of overwhelming health systems, which frankly don't have a huge capacity, that is causing all this social distancing to be put in place. So if a vaccine can reduce that threshold, we're much better off. We're getting a lot of questions in, as expected, on mutations, MINC mutations of all sorts. I think you guys have launched today an initiative in this area. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. No, we're very excited. Today we were able to announce a partnership with an organization called GISAID, GISAID, which is an organization that collects genetic sequences from around the world for COVID-19, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But the other partners are here in the UK. It's Public Health England and the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control, or NIBSC. And what this partnership will do is GISAID has been collecting sequences of the SARS-CoV-2 virus since the beginning of the pandemic, and they actually have accumulated, this is an amazing fact, they've accumulated some over 200,000 sequences. So of the total number of people who've been documented to have an infection, 1 out of every 250 infections worldwide, the sequence is now entered in the GISAID database, and they can monitor, changes and mutations in the virus over time, in different lineages over time, and using computer modeling, they can estimate and where the mutations are occurring, they can estimate whether the mutation might have an impact on the susceptibility of the virus to the vaccines or to antibodies. Public Health England and NIBSC are going to work together to create a capability if viruses emerge that would appear to provide risk for a significant change, or the ability to evade vaccines or antibodies, to be able to actually test those viruses very quickly to see if we have a real emerging problem. So this will become the basis for a global, surveillance and rapid assessment capability for COVID-19, which I think is pretty important given the recent findings, as you mentioned, with the minks in Denmark and elsewhere.
I mean, how worried do you think we should be about the minks? Do you think that is going to be a threat to vaccines, or is it too soon? Well,
the thing that's concerning about the minks, and just in case any of the viewers aren't familiar with this, there was an outbreak of COVID-19. It got into mink populations in Denmark, and now have been documented in mink populations in at least 5 other countries. And it spread very rapidly. And what was concerning is that we then saw that there were infections occurring in at least 200 people in Denmark who had been infected by the minks. One of the reasons that's concerning, there are 2 reasons it's concerning. We already know that the virus got into human populations ultimately from bats, and it may have gone through an intermediate species in China, spread very rapidly in humans. We know it can infect cats, dogs, other animal species. It can have a wide number of hosts, which is going to make it very difficult to deal with. The mink viruses were concerning because at least 12 of the people who were infected with a virus that appears to be able to evade the antibodies from previous infections. And
Right.
that's pretty scary.
So all viruses over time mutate and drift in the technology, in the terminology. Do you expect COVID-19 to follow that pattern, and perhaps, like flu, eventually we'll need to be giving slightly different vaccines every couple of years?
Potentially. I mean, we already, through the GISA work that has been done to date, we are already tracking the evolution and mutation of COVID-19. The vast majority of the mutations don't really present any significant risk because they're occurring in parts of the virus that really have no impact on how the immune system responds to it. But all viruses mutate over time. They just have deficiencies in their replication, and errors get introduced, and those errors are mutations. And sometimes those mutations will occur in places that are actually really important. And so I think over time, yes, we may see new lineages of the virus emerge that may not be as susceptible to people, to vaccines or to previous immunity. And I think that would be a natural process. Now, how rapidly that happens remains to be seen. How rapidly we will need to make adjustments in vaccines or revaccinate people remains to be seen. We've only been living with this virus for 10 months, and we have a lot yet to learn about it.
We'll come back to some readers' questions because they're still flying in a moment, but I really want to ask you about how we distribute it across the globe. We've had a lot about equitable distribution, but at the moment, for instance, Moderna and Pfizer, the two companies that we know have a vaccine that seems to work, the majority of doses currently available have been bought by wealthy countries. Is there a risk that the disease could bounce back stronger if we don't have equitable distribution? And I know that you've been instrumental in founding COVAX, so I'm sure readers would love to hear a bit more about that as well.
Sure, no, thanks for bringing COVAX up. I will say before I talk about COVAX, there are really two reasons that we have to have equitable distribution of vaccine and global distribution of vaccine. And the first, I think, is, ethically, from a humanitarian perspective, it is the right thing to do. That is a very important reason, and for many people, that reason by itself is sufficiently compelling to justify the investment in making sure that vaccines are globally distributed. But there's also a reason strictly from enlightened self-interest, which is if we don't protect people everywhere, if we don't help countries everywhere begin to come back to normal activity, the virus will continue to spread in an uncontrolled fashion. It will prolong the pandemic. It will result in millions of extra deaths, which ultimately would be unnecessary deaths, and it will result in prolongation of the economic pain that the pandemic is causing. And the world is interconnected. So you cannot exist in one country and not be impacted by the economic damage to countries around you. I think Sweden saw this over the summer. They did not introduce lockdowns, and they had sort of a laissez-faire approach to managing the virus. And yet they still suffered major economic disruptions because of the surrounding damage to other economies. And so I think the strongest reason for distributing vaccine equitably actually is it's the fastest way to end the pandemic. And that is why COVAX, which is a partnership between my organization, CEPI, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and WHO, was set up. It was set up to basically develop, procure, distribute, and dispense vaccines to all countries around the world. And I'm very excited to say just a couple of days ago, Namibia announced that they were going to join COVAX. They become the 187th participant in the effort, and COVAX is now the largest multilateral effort since the Paris Agreement.
So
Wow.
there is reason to be optimistic there. But we know, and I think you know from past experience in pandemics, when there's a rush for vaccine, governments are quite naturally focused on their own. Are you ultimately optimistic this time that world leaders in richer nations can be convinced to see the bigger picture and to invest overseas in order to bring the pandemic to an end more rapidly?
I am optimistic. I mean, we are already seeing many high-income countries, almost all of the high-income countries are participating in COVAX. They have provided billions of dollars of support, both for vaccine development and now for procurement of vaccines, both for their own populations and for lower-income countries that are participating in COVAX. And I think what is different this time, and I think very helpful, one of the, scarcity is the enemy of equity. And what we are seeing in terms of the global effort to develop vaccines, we have more than 300 vaccines under development, I think 48 now in clinical trials, 10 in phase 3. We have a extraordinarily rich portfolio of vaccines, and many of these vaccines will become available in the first half of 2021, and they will all maximize their production. And our estimate, and this is a rough estimate, it varies a little bit from country to country, but our estimate is that the part of the population that it's really critical to get vaccine to quickly, being these, the healthcare workers, the high-risk populations, is probably in most countries between 20 and 30% of the population. So you don't have to vaccinate everybody in a country in order to end the acute phase of the pandemic.
Okay. Yeah, that's an important point. Can I just ask, the readers are asking about the Oxford vaccine. I know that it's one of the vaccines that CEPI was early to back. I also know the results are not out yet, but tell us a little bit. Are you optimistic about the results? I think there's reason to be optimistic about its production capability.
Well, we are optimistic. We've been big supporters of the Oxford technology for a long time. We were actually partnered with Oxford on a number of other diseases that CEPI was working on before COVID-19, and we moved very rapidly to provide resources to them to enable them to shift gears and to begin to focus on COVID-19. And of course, we were very excited when they established the partnership with AstraZeneca, because AstraZeneca brings all of the capabilities of a large pharmaceutical firm, both in terms of development and in terms of global distribution. And AstraZeneca has really done an amazing job to try to establish manufacturing globally, increase that global supply. We will soon see the vaccine is now, in clinical trials in the United States, in the UK, and Brazil, and other countries. And we are anticipating potentially seeing results from that vaccine in the next several weeks. It was really running, nearly neck and neck with the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, and we'll see what those results show. I certainly am feeling better about all of the vaccine candidates because they're all targeting this so-called spike protein on the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that's the protein that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines targeted. It's the same protein that the AstraZeneca vaccine is targeting, and of course we've seen very, very high rates of protection with the first two vaccines.
So there's reason to hope that this might be the beginning of the end. Diving into the vaccines, you mentioned earlier about protecting the most vulnerable first. Do we have any indication of whether a vaccine might actually work in older populations? What's the breakdown of the trials? Lots of readers are kind of wanting more information on whether we can be confident it works in over 65-year-olds. And kind of adding to that, if a vaccine shows to stop transmission as well as stopping severe disease, would it be time for us to rethink our vaccination strategies and actually vaccinate those who might have the most contacts or jobs where they're coming into more contact with people, to curb transmission that way rather than injecting or vaccinating more elderly or vulnerable populations?
Sure. So let me the two questions there. Let me take the first one, which is, what do we know about protection in older populations who are the ones that are at greatest risk? Because there is, just for the viewers, vaccines often show diminished efficacy in elderly populations because of the aging of the immune system. We got a hint of this with some of the Moderna phase 1 clinical trial data from the very first clinical trials. They did look at it in elderly populations and saw a really robust antibody response in elderly populations. And that was not showing whether it worked or not, but we saw the kind of response that we would hope to see in older populations. And so we've had a hint that the Moderna vaccine, would potentially have a good response in the elderly. The Pfizer news announced today, the second release announced today, had some great news. Besides saying that the protective efficacy of the vaccine was 95%, even better than they reported about 10 days ago. They looked at its efficacy in elderly populations, 94% effectiveness in preventing disease in the elderly, an astonishing result. Great news there. Now, on the severity question, Moderna, in its announcement earlier this week, did look at there were only 95 cases of COVID-19 disease in the study population up until the point that they announced the results. 90 of those cases were in people who had received the placebo. And of the 90 cases, there were 11 cases of severe disease. And all of the cases of severe disease that were observed out of the 30,000 people who were vaccinated were in those who received the placebo, which is a pretty strong suggestion. I haven't seen the statistical analysis, but a pretty strong suggestion that the Moderna vaccine can protect against severe disease. And of course, we're all judging based on results announced in press releases, and we're all waiting for the formal scientific presentation of this data. Now, your question was, if we can see that the vaccine can prevent severe disease, is there an argument for focusing the vaccine on those who are perhaps responsible for more transmission rather than focusing on those who are at greatest risk? And I think that's not really a function of the characteristics of the vaccine as much as it is a function of the supply of vaccine. And when vaccine is in very short supply, you are better off targeting it at those at greatest risk of bad outcomes. And as the vaccine supply increases, then you can shift your strategy towards maybe a transmission focus.
So
strategy.
Richard, we're almost out of time now in this segment. Can I ask you one general question, put you on the spot right at the end? When will we get back to normal? We've got a lockdown in the UK now. It ends on the 2nd of December.
Fingers crossed.
Some people say spring, some people say summer. Bill Gates, I think, thinks the end of the year, well, end of next year. When will we really get back to normal?
Well, I think you're giving me an opportunity to set everybody's expectations appropriately. What we've got right now are extraordinary phase 3 clinical trial results. What we don't have is a lot of vaccine that has been licensed and is ready to go out to everybody. That's almost certainly going to come pretty soon, and vaccine supply will be ramped up as quickly as it can be produced. It's going to vary country by country. Certainly, I think those in the UK are likely to be among the first countries that have an ample supply of vaccine. If I had to hazard, I would say that in the UK, particularly if these other vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccine and other vaccines, show the same levels of effectiveness, same level of safety, plausibly, I'm going to hedge and be a little conservative and say summer in the UK, but that's not around the world. Our desire through COVAX is to help in the acute phase of the pandemic, that severe phase, by the end of 2021 globally.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah and Richard. Brilliant.
Thanks.
We're going to move on to the
you.
next session now. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Right. I hope you enjoyed that and got some useful information. Richard really is the world authority looking at a broad, from a broad viewpoint at vaccines. And we consult with him a lot at the Telegraph for all the stories we write about vaccines. So moving on now to treatments, bringing on Dr. Mike Elliott, Vice President of Gilead Sciences. Are you there, Mike?
I am here. Can you?
Yes, there you go. We've got you there. And
Sorry.
Anne Gulland, my colleague, should be there as well. Are you there, Anne?
Yeah, I think so. Just coming.
You're just coming along. Got your mic on? Okay, good. So this next part of the evening is going to focus really on treatments and the second wave of the pandemic that we're all locked in at the moment. So viewers, please send in questions. Anne and I will scan them as we go along and hopefully be able to get Mike to answer some of them. So let me kick off. Mike, you work for Gilead. Gilead is the producer of the only antiviral drug for COVID-19, remdesivir. Tell us a little bit about the development of that product and how it works. How does it fight the disease?
Thanks. Yeah, and so I am at Gilead Sciences. We're an antiviral specialist company, if you will. We've been doing antiviral research for 30 years. And quite surprising is that we've actually had remdesivir under research for 10 years now. It's a molecule and a medicine we've had looking at potential viruses where it could work. And so when COVID came along at the beginning of this year, you know, we tested our library and found that remdesivir worked in the lab as an antiviral drug. So then we accelerated very much into clinical testing to see if it works in the disease itself in this pandemic and if it's effective, but also if it's safe enough to give to a large number of patients. So we conducted many trials ourselves, and also you know, other groups conducted trials using remdesivir, including the NIH in the US, who did probably the largest, most controlled, significant study that gave us and physicians the data they needed to have some confidence. So it works as an antiviral. And just very quickly, coronavirus really has two stages. The early stage is when the virus is reproducing very rapidly, causing those, you could call them severe flu-like symptoms, the fever, the headaches, the cough, feeling like you're aching all over, needing to be in bed. That's the first week or 10 days. Then it progresses as your immune system takes over and starts to fight the virus, but also has impact on your multi-organ system. So it can impact your kidneys, your liver, your lungs more severely. And it's that early stage where the antiviral effects of remdesivir have the most effect rather than the later stage. And we found that borne out in all of the studies we've done, actually.
Yep.
Thanks for that. So I've got a question. So with the WHO, the World Health Organization, and its big solidarity trial, which was 11,000 patients, they trialed remdesivir and found that it didn't have a huge benefit, but other trials have found benefit of remdesivir. So what is the sort of, you know, from Gilead's point of view, obviously you're going to say that you think it's good, but what's your sort of view on what the benefit is and what it can do for patients?
Yeah, the benefits are very clear, and I think those two studies, at first blush, they might look to be contradictory, but they're not. Let me just go into that a little bit. So the studies I mentioned earlier, very well-controlled, randomized, placebo-controlled studies, the standard for evaluating drugs and showing them to regulators to get approved if the data are there. Those studies we conducted and showed clearly that in the early stage patients I described just now, you can reduce the duration of illness by 5 days. That 5 days, really important to the patient and their loved ones to reduce the symptoms and be able to get home. Also really important to the hospitals to have maybe that intensive care bed freed up for 5 days. So that's
a lot of money, 5 days, isn't it?
Potentially a lot of money as well. And so that data is what we've used to get remdesivir's early approvals around the world. The WHO study was a different study, really ambitious, really important to do. The two main aims of it were to treat a large number of patients around the world with coronavirus disease, and just looking at one endpoint of mortality. So how many patients died on a number of treatments, one of which was indeed remdesivir. The group of patients, and these were recruited from around the world, both across Europe, the US, but also many patients, most patients in Africa, South America, and parts of Asia. And the group of patients was later in the disease. And I described how you have the virus as most important in the early stage and of lesser importance later on. And the patients in the WHO are more in that middle stage to later stage of disease. And the results were that we didn't see an effect on mortality in the group treated with remdesivir. And indeed, that's not been a major finding in the studies we've done. The mortality has been less impacted than that duration of illness and severity of illness. So I think the WHO study, really important study to do. They achieved what they set out to achieve. And I'd say it's in some way complementary to the other study results rather than directly contradictory.
Well, President Trump got it, didn't he?
Apparently so, yes.
So it's a drug that has to be given relatively early in the development of the disease. How readily available is it to patients entering hospital now in the UK?
It's available. I mean, we've worked very hard to ramp up our manufacturing from that February start. We've gone from something like 3 or 4 factories to now 40 factories around the world. We ramped up and we reduced manufacturing time from 12 months to 6 months. We've greatly increased our logistics and supply chain, and we work very closely with the European Commission and government health systems around Europe in this case. So in the UK specifically, remdesivir has been available since the beginning of the pandemic, but in much more supply as we've gone from sort of April, May through the summer and to where we are now. So it's, in short, it's available in the UK for the right patients.
So tell me a little bit on the investment side. I'm just looking at the readers' questions coming in here. There's some cynicism. It's not directed at Gilead. It's just general about big pharma. You know, how do we know big pharma isn't just making money? When do they start to profit? Maybe you could just address that, because I think when I was a regular sort of news desk journalist, I was also very cynical about big pharma. I've come to be a little bit more supportive as a health journalist. Tell us a little bit about how the business side of things interacts with the with the medical side.
Yeah, I'd say the pandemic actually gives, really puts that system under pressure and shows the value of big pharma, whether it's Gilead, who we're talking about with antivirals, or all of the vaccine companies. So what we've done is before we really knew whether this medicine was going to work properly, we invested very heavily in our manufacturing capacity. You can't open 40 factories at zero cost. We did all of that. The first 1.5 million vials we made available free to be used, so that people could get access to treatment under medical care. And we've ramped up our supply chain globally. So we've given our intellectual property to 9 generic manufacturers, mostly in India, to manufacture at bulk, to make sure that the 127 least developed, least wealthy nations have access to remdesivir at a very low cost. And indeed, it's been shipped to 40 of those, shipped and used in 40 of those countries already. And that wouldn't happen without without the funds we have made from previous medicines to invest in this new innovation. I think the model works. It certainly deserves to be tested and challenged. But again, on a pricing basis for remdesivir, we set a global price for the developed world, which has allowed us to, quicker than we've ever before, get access to all of the European countries, as an example, but also to the countries of Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world which don't have the logistics or the research capabilities themselves. And I'm not an expert in the vaccine business, but I think the same model is true there as well.
It may be worth just talking briefly about the licensing model that you mentioned there. I traveled to Tanzania, where Gilead distributes antivirals for HIV at now I think it works out at $1 a day. It's very, very cheap. And I think that's done through the same system, right? That you
exactly
talk a
right.
bit about that system and how it works, so readers understand it.
So we've developed that system over, since really the HIV epidemic started. We had some of the early medicines there, and it took some time to work out how you could change this, let's call it the Western pharma model, to manage critical diseases in all parts of the world. And we got to this system that you couldn't use the factories and the logistics we had in the US and in Europe. You had to have something both closer to where the need was, but also with the mass manufacturing capability to supply the huge need in Africa. So we have that model. We give our intellectual property to those generic manufacturers, the technology and knowledge how to make the medicine. They have the mass production capability to do it at very low cost, and a cost that allows successful use across Africa. In the example of Tanzania, we've done the same in hepatitis C and hepatitis B as well, which are much more of a severe problem in those parts of the world. And it works. And we spent a few years getting the model right. For sure, we made some mistakes, but it works, and it is a well-established model, again, for other manufacturers and indeed vaccine manufacturers.
Okay, thanks. I think I might ask us, I've got a couple of questions myself, and there's also some that are being asked by the readers, I noticed. There's been quite a few questions about vitamin D. I don't know if this is anything you know about, Mike, whether you can answer whether vitamin D is good. And also, I just wondered what other potential treatments are there and potential antivirals there are out there that you think might be good. And you talked about your, talk a bit about your library of antivirals as well. That would be great, thank you.
Okay, so I'm not an expert in vitamin D, so I read the same science journals as other people. It's been an early interest in the positive effect, and I think my assessment, my non-expert assessment, is that the data is gradually mounting. That's an important adjunct, is to have vitamin D. I think the general advice of keeping vitamins and minerals and healthy eating at a time of a circulating virus makes good, but it seems that vitamin D does stand out.
Is it true that if you're over 50, you should take vitamin D every day anyway? I'm sure I've read that.
If there's any other health experts on the line, I'm probably going to get into trouble, so I'm not going to answer that one.
So yeah, and I'm sure I read that over those of us who are over 50, who I'm sure that's just me that have to take that. But yeah, so could you talk about what other treatments? Other
treatments are interesting, and we're involved in research in many of these. So combinations with remdesivir and other treatments. I think, I'm not sure if we talked about dexamethasone earlier, but dexamethasone, a very well-established steroid, works in that late stage of the disease and reduces mortality. A very clear study from the group in Oxford conducted across the UK shows that. So there are the other approaches fall into 2 or 3 categories. In the immunological category, you have monoclonal antibodies have been tried, and so far the data is I'd say mixed to disappointing on those. And there's and then also the pooled plasma approach, which you mentioned President Trump, so I can mention him as well. He received that. And the data is yet not at the stage of being mature. It's not like remdesivir that's been submitted to regulators with adequate data. The vaccines we've heard about, which I think are extremely close to that. So the data is still being evaluated. I think everyone hopes that there will be other drugs and approaches to add to remdesivir and dexamethasone, really the only 2 established, but those aren't there yet. But the pace of research is phenomenal. So I think during this year, but probably more into the early parts of next year, we'll get more data readouts.
Because there were some HIV drugs that were tried, weren't there? Was it?
Yeah, they were tried and it was unsuccessful. Those were easy to test because those were readily available and were tested in the early months, and everyone held hope, but that didn't come through, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, do you think the treatments have been a bit disappointing, or that the vaccine? There's been massive amount of vaccine, obviously, but.
Look, it would. I mean, again, and the timeline has been so telescoped. Normally, you'll develop drugs for a virus at the quickest in 4 to 5 years, more often 7 to 10. So the fact that we've found out that dexamethasone works, an available medicine, we have remdesivir that clearly works, and we have the vaccines now, and we're all in the same calendar year. I can't call that disappointing. I think that's really positive. There's still more to do. But there is a lot of research going on.
And there's also just the treatment, isn't there? The care, things like, turning the patients, putting them on their front, proning them. There's all sorts of things, aren't there? It's not just about.
There were results out today from the UK ICU unit, so the Intensive Care Association put them out, and that shows that deaths and invasive treatments, putting people on ventilators and the like, has been cut in half in this second wave. I'm sure that's partly to do with treatments like remdesivir and steroids, but probably other things involved there, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen that data and actually earlier data suggesting that, and actually talking to colleagues and friends in intensive care. They've learned a lot about the total care of the patient. So as you say, how to position them to support the breathing, when to use oxygen early, when to consider a ventilator probably later if you can do it, what other therapies to use apart from remdesivir and dexamethasone in the right patients, and just the total patient care. And I think the intensive care teams have done phenomenal work around the world in extraordinary stressful conditions. But I do think as we go into this second wave that the ability to give better care to patients based on that practical research is very real.
And do you think that's likely to continue to improve, or is that a sort of a quick wave of learning by intensive care doctors, or will they hone that total care over time?
I'm sure it'll be honed. The unfortunate truth is the pace of this virus and the number of cases has allowed them to very quickly gain a lot of experience in what works and maybe what doesn't work. Now they've got to crunch through all that data, publish it, as you mentioned today, get that published and reviewed. And intensive cares around the world will be sharing their experience to optimize. And again, that's something that normally in a normal disease would happen over years, and it's just been telescoped into this year. So more will come, and more improvements for sure will come.
One thing I was interested in, I think we touched on it a bit with the vaccines. It's about this kind of idea of publishing. I think it was one of the questions further up about things being published by press release, whereas normally they get published in a peer-reviewed journal. Obviously people want to get their information out very quickly, but do you think that's a problem, that we're sort of bypassing the kind of usual scientific processes in a way?
Yeah, no, I take your point. I think it's really important that clinicians and departments of health who make decisions on behalf of us and the patients, they need to review the proper data before they take a treatment decision, and that's either data with the regulatory, the government authority, or it's data in a peer-reviewed journal. I mean, that is the standard. So as long as that follows very quickly after the press release, and no major policy decisions are made until the science has been properly evaluated, that's okay. But you couldn't rely on a press release to make major changes in how you manage patients. I mean, the vaccines, there might have been a press release, but those aren't available to be used or used in the wrong way yet. So there's no harm done there. We now need, and I'm sure we will see, the peer-reviewed publications coming very soon.
Just moving away a little bit from remdesivir, back to this library of compounds that you guys have. There's a question here, is Gilead carrying out large screening of different compounds against SARS-CoV-2?
Yeah, that's basically the bread and butter of our business. Is we have this library, literally a library of all the different molecules we've tested and made over time. We have a great team of medicinal chemists. So both for existing viruses, but also when new viruses come along, we would know, as SARS-CoV-2 came along, we would know, let's say, what shelf of the library might be appropriate to test. That could be many hundreds of chemicals. So we would test all of those, in the test tube to start with, in the lab with computer technology and screening, narrow it down, and then take forward a smaller number to take to the next level of testing. So that's a very standard practice for us. So in this case, remdesivir was the only one that came through anywhere close to hitting the targets of probably going to be efficacious, is going to be safe to use, and can be absorbed and distributed around the body in the right way.
Still looking for others?
Well, we've really gone through the library, so we've gone through many thousands in the very earliest days. So there's no other ones in there that are as good as remdesivir in delivering what's needed.
But I presume other companies will be doing the same thing, will they, with their library of molecules?
Yes, I mean, they would have, but they would have done it at the very beginning for sure. I mean, usually there's a very immediate connection with the government people who work on such things to the companies who might be involved to screen the libraries and bring forward any medicines. I mean, it happened with remdesivir. In fact, when Ebola was a major problem, that we were doing the work ourselves anyway, but with a lot of pressure from governments to accelerate that work.
And
right.
Antivirals as a class of drug. We hear a lot about, everyone knows about antibiotics, everyone knows about vaccines. We don't really hear much about antivirals as a class of drug. Is it a relatively modern class of drug? Is it one that we're going to be hearing lots more of as life moves on?
I think it is. I mean, it's not that modern because antivirals have been around, since before the 80s, actually. I mean, antibiotics famously at the end of the Second World War, so a little bit longer. Antivirals originally were, harder to manufacture, and it's a harder disease to manage. The way the virus interacts with the host, it sometimes makes it hard. I mean, all of the viruses are very different. But, you could think of viruses such as HIV, for instance, hepatitis virus, many people have heard of, and then viruses like the common cold and the flu. Now, there's not an antiviral for the common cold. There are antivirals for the flu. So when you think about it, they have been around since in broadish use since the 80s. For instance, diseases such as shingles and chickenpox as an antiviral for those diseases. But you maybe don't think as obviously of an antibiotic as you do an antiviral, but indeed they are around.
Do they all work through a single common mechanism?
broadly, they target the the virus is its genetic code is called RNA. They will usually and nearly always target that in some specific way, some part of the RNA. It might be a different part, but that's what the antiviral is attacking, to stop the replication and reproduction of the virus. It's just that these viruses are very different. Even the two main hepatitis viruses, hepatitis B, for which we've had a treatment for many years, and hepatitis C, those treatments have only just come along recently, but are very impressive in how they can, you can cure a hepatitis C patient. It's phenomenally hard to cure a hepatitis B patient. So the viruses are a bit different. The antivirals are a bit different.
I was just wondering if you would have ever foreseen a pandemic like this. Do you think this is something that you would have ever imagined, to have affected practically every single person on the planet in so many different ways? Is this something you would have ever envisaged?
I think not really, but maybe not so surprising. If we think of the days when we're thinking about bird flu, it seems like a long time ago, and then MERS and SARS came along, and a whole bunch of movies and books written about it, and even the pandemic dry run was done a few years ago in many of the countries. So I guess, although we always thought about it and talked about it, I don't think anyone could have predicted we'd be where we are now at the end of 2020. No, not really.
It's crazy.
It is interesting that, because there's so much written about it, so much predicting it, but no one viscerally sort of understood it. What are the things that have surprised you most about the pandemic and our reaction to it?
I think the speed at which almost everything happened. So whether that's developing antivirals, developing vaccines, I don't think anyone could have predicted that speed sitting in January. I think the speed that we've done things such as lockdown, that travel has stopped. I think then some of the terrible things that have happened, damage to the economy. Could we have believed such a damage to economy and we're still standing? The terrible impact on people's lives, whether hospitalized or impacted by the economic damage. I think they're all quite surprising. But I take the positive note out is the response, the overall response, whether it's people working in the health service, people working on medicines and vaccines, the government responses. I think people have taken to the change and the terrible challenge quite positively.
I think the scientific response has been phenomenal. The amount of papers that are being published, every day, it is really amazing. And I think the UK can kind of pat themselves a bit on the back with, things like the recovery trial are really great. So
yeah, no, there has been great research, and it's really good to see a huge amount of great research coming out of the UK.
Right, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to finish with the same question to you as to Richard Hatchett. When do you think it's all going to be over? When will our lives return to normal?
So it's easy for me to follow Richard, but before I heard his answer, I would have said, particularly now with the vaccine news, and again, vaccines aren't going to get to everyone they need to until probably the back end of next year. So I would think by the time we get to next summer, we'll be feeling much more that the winter ahead of us will be more like a normal winter than this winter. But I don't think we'll ever return exactly to where we were before. I think with everything suddenly having lockdown, I think a whole load of things will change, and many of them for the positive, actually. But so I think through the back half of next year.
I'm going to push you on that. What are the positives that are going to come out of the pandemic?
Oh, you've got a mask wearing business. That's what a mask business, haven't you? That's why.
No, I think I think things like respect for public health and the health service, the importance of managing health holistically, both nationally and globally, I think is there. I think paying attention to everyone in our communities and societies. I think people have really woken up to that. And then I'd add, the impact on the climate of all this not traveling might make us think, did we need to do all that traveling?
Well, listen, we're going to end on that positive note. Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, Mike. Thank you to all the readers who have logged on and listened and asked questions. We're very pleased to have you. Thank you.